Welcome to the worst nightmare of all. Reality.
Explore the lesser-known stories of our unknown world. Join the pursuit of the paranormal with Ash and Greg.
This week, we are joined by Chris Rutkowski. Who's a famed Canadian ufologist. Thanks for joining us, Chris. Thank you for coming on the show.
Glad to be here. I hope I'm more famed than infamed.
Definitely, I think.
Definitely, yeah.
So you are a science writer. You've appeared on many TV shows. You've authored over 10 books. You've got a degree in astronomy, a degree in education. So that seems to be quite a scientific background. So which is obviously good in sort of UFO field. You don't see many are actually in the scientific field.
Yeah, I try to look at UFOs from a scientific viewpoint. I became curious and interested in UFOs back when I was an undergrad in university. Actually, I guess I was interested back in high school, but I really became more interested in university. My profs were unanimously unimpressed with UFOs and thought the whole thing was poppycock. But there were a lot of UFO reports at the time that I was in undergrad, and I thought I would take it on myself to take the phone calls that were coming in, because my profs are getting quite annoyed by all the people who were reporting UFOs and calling and wanting to know what they were seeing. So I thought I would suck up. I mean, I thought I would assist my professors to alleviate them from this onerous burden and talk to some of the people who were reporting. And I ended up talking with many people. I traveled around the countryside, speaking with people in their farms, out at their homes, all across the country. And I found, I could explain most of the cases. They seemed, pretty honest mistakes, but there were some that I didn't understand. And so I just chalked that up to, I'm not sure what this is. And eventually it turned out that I was asked to give a presentation in university after a year or so on what I had heard. There was an opening in the Department of Physics discussions. They often had Friday afternoon seminars, and somebody had canceled, and they said, well, would you like to talk about what you've heard about UFOs? Because everybody's hearing about it. And it was usually given to professors and their graduate students, but I guess the word got around that somebody was talking about UFOs, and I ended up speaking to an auditorium full of people all about the UFOs. That was my baptism by fire back in the 1970s.
How was that received?
It was received very well. I became Canada's UFO guy in the eyes of a lot of people. So,
how old were you then when you?
I was. Let's see. Back then, I was just about 20 back then, and I'm much older now.
I gotta say, because you have been doing this for quite a long time. I think since the 80s or the 70s. It's back when you started taking them calls.
Yeah, I started investigating back in the mid 1970s. There had been a bit of a flap in our part of Canada at that time, and since then I had been investigating and writing and getting published about what I'd been hearing from people. And in the late 1980s, I wanted to do a more statistical analysis. I wanted to know exactly what people were seeing in Canada. And there really wasn't a good source for that. No database that could say, there's more on the east coast of Canada versus the west coast, and how many reports involved green objects versus yellow objects and that type of thing. So I just wanted to get, a sense of this. So I went through the reports, and I think the first time we did it was 1988. And then I did a cross-Canada study in 1989, which became the Canadian UFO Survey. And I got and solicited cooperation from my colleagues across the country. We just did a basically count and sort. How many reports were there in Canada in that particular year? What time were they seen? What date? That type of thing. I think there was around 150 cases that we had at that time. It was received so well. In fact, people are talking about how the mainstream media doesn't take it seriously. Well, this was taken very seriously. I don't think we got any negative ridicule at the time from Canadian media, and this was national media. People were very fascinated, and because of the positive response, we continued doing it, so that now in 2022, I think we're doing our 32nd or 33rd version of the Canadian UFO survey, and we've amassed something like somewhere between 20 and 25,000 UFO reports, which is much more than Blue Book ever got, of course. And we have an interesting database, so it's interesting to actually look at the individual reports, because the reports, the UFO reports themselves that people send in, or right now they're emailing us or sending along through Facebook Messenger and putting them on Reddit and so forth. This is the foundation upon which all the speculation about, are they grays, are they Mattises, are they using electromagnetism for propulsion, are they using some element 115? I mean, all of that is all speculation based on what people are reporting to be seen. And when you look at the individual reports, you get a very, very different perspective on the UFO phenomenon. And it also allows me and my colleagues to get into a reasonable dialogue with the science community about what people are seeing. Because, I mean, the scientific community often sees some of the tabloid journalism and they don't want to go anywhere near that. But there are some scientific studies on UFOs. Some people have actually used our data to teach statistics at university. And I've given presentations in an academic setting quite a bit. In fact, I've published in academic peer-reviewed journals. There are master's and doctoral theses that are published on UFOs every year. So there actually is a scientific interest in this, but you got to be, you can't just go off willy-nilly. You can't, have a pyramid on your head and talk about telepathically communicating with the blondes and the Zeta Reticulians and so forth. But you do have to talk in terms that science will appreciate and understand. And that's why I've taken this approach, and I try and advocate it as much as possible. That's not to say that I don't talk with people who have contactee and abduction stories and are more into the mystical. And I've been more Fortean than anything else. I started out, in fact, I think one of my first published articles was in the Fortean Times books. So, I appreciate and understand the Forteana aspect of it and the paranormal aspects. And I've studied everything from clairvoyance to ghost photography to EVP and psychometry. So, I've worked with clinical psychologists, I've worked with psychics, but I'm doing it from a scientific perspective, and I really want to see if we could get to some scientific understanding of what's going on.
So has there been a change, say, in the media approach since back in the 70s and 80s to today? Have you noticed, in Canada especially?
Well, yeah, I know there's a lot of people are saying that there's a groundswell now regarding mainstream media taking an interest in UFOs and taking it seriously. I've experienced that all along. I've been on national news broadcasts. I've been on many television series, between unsolved mysteries to A&E. I've been on all sorts of UFO shows, but the mainstream media, every year when the Canadian UFO survey comes out, I actually get calls and emails from media wanting to know what the latest numbers are, and they take it very seriously. And there's only a few that laugh and giggle and that type of thing, but they take it fairly seriously, and they realize that their readership and viewership want to know. So I've been published in major newspapers and magazines. In fact, Reader's Digest, the formidable American publication, just had a fascinating article that's in, I think, the October and November issue of Reader's Digest, which talks about our research. So, there's a lot of mainstream stuff that's always been going on. In fact, people point to the New York Times as finally taking an interest in UFOs. Well, if you actually look through the index of the New York Times and look up UFO, there's been many serious articles about UFOs that haven't involved ridicule. So, I suppose in some ways there's a slightly more mainstream interest in UFOs. Maybe it's just from the sheer number of cases that we're getting, or the sheer number of media that are interested right now. And media are desperate for anything but COVID right now, so they'll eat up anything UFO, I think.
Yeah, so on that note, because our media is the opposite to what you described. It's always the red tops tabloids that front cover, just joking headlines. And during the lockdown, it was all in the papers that UFO sightings had increased during lockdown and all this. But similar to you, I run a database of current day sightings. I believe it to be the biggest UK database of current day sightings from 2020 onwards. It's quite new. Took a lot of inspiration from your database actually the last couple of years. I was building mine.
Right.
As I collate all from different sources like MUFON, UFOC, all the different places to build this sort of one place you can find all UK data. And during lockdown, it was all in the media that UFO sightings had increased during the COVID pandemic. But the data I've got says that it hasn't. There's not much difference. If anything, there's a slight decrease. I was just wondering whether in your data you had seen any changes during the COVID-19.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, because we're monitoring it very closely every year, we have a good sense of this. It turns out that in 2020, there was a tremendous increase in the number of UFO reports in Canada, and also to a large extent in the United States. If you look at the main databases in North America, like NUFORC, MUFON, and so forth, they all had tremendous increases. Curiously enough, they started before lockdowns. The increases were mostly between the first quarter, or in the first quarter between January and April of 2020, which is really before lockdowns really got in. But they remained a high level throughout the entire year of 2020. In fact, it was something like, 30 or 40% over the previous year, over 2019. Now, I don't have the full numbers for 2021 yet. In fact, just before we started working on the podcast tonight, I was entering some of the cases for 2021. They're slowly coming, and it takes a little while. We probably won't have them ready until February or March of this year. But we've noticed that the numbers are down. In fact, dramatically down, probably by half of 2020. Now, given that 2020 was dramatically up, maybe we're going back to a regular level. And there's a lot of ideas about why this would be. Now, we don't have the numbers completely entered. We don't know how much of a drop it is, but we do know it's significantly less than 2020. And the explanation why it was so high in 2020 was because of the pandemic, that more people were staying home. They weren't going out to the pub because you couldn't go out to the pub. You had to stay home, and maybe you're looking in your backyard and looking up into the sky and seeing UFOs. And maybe that was what was occurring. Well, in 2021, the lockdowns are still around. In fact, some of them, I think some of the lockdowns here in Canada are actually more strict than 2020. So why are the numbers down? And some of the speculation is because of COVID fatigue, that people aren't even going outside anymore. They're not bothering. They're hunkering down. You're not looking into the sky. They're really doing some introspection, and maybe that has something to do with it. So we don't know yet, but it is interesting that the numbers do fluctuate quite a bit. In Canada, we had, for the past 10 years or so, we were looking at somewhere around 1,000 UFO sightings reported every year. and it was increasing regularly every year. Who knows what the future is going to bring, and who knows where the numbers are eventually going to settle down.
Just ask, what's the population of Canada?
35 million.
Wow, that's a lot of sightings.
Oh, sorry, no. I mean that's the population of Canada is 35 million. So 1,000 reported cases, and we actually have done a thought experiment that. So we have 1,000 cases on average per year. We know that the average sighting has 2 witnesses. That's 2,000. We know that only 10% of all UFO sightings get reported. So you can multiply that by 2, or by 10 rather. So that's 20,000 people who had seen UFOs in any particular year. And that's in one particular year. And when you think that that over the course of, let's say, 20 years, a typical person will be lucky to see a UFO once or twice in a lifetime, unless you're an avid watcher. But if you multiply 20,000 by 20, you're looking at 400,000, and all you're approaching the numbers of the population by a factor of 10 or 100. So maybe a significant proportion of the cases are getting reported. I don't know.
I just wonder, have you noticed, based on some of the findings you've got over the last couple of years, has there been a change in the type of sightings that are being reported?
Yeah, we have noticed some changes. I mean, the classic flying saucer is long gone from reports. In the 90s, we had triangles, but that was the era of the X-Files as well. Typically, we get the UFO sightings that we're getting now. They're mostly just lights. In fact, gone are the days of the close encounters. Where it used to be back in the 60s and 70s, there were close encounters of the second kind where trace cases were found, marks were found on the ground, burned out areas, and so forth. As an aside, when crop circles started appearing in the 80s and into the 90s, the evidence and trace cases associated with UFOs almost completely vanished. So it seemed that the crop formations and the agroglyphs, or whatever people want to call them, sort of took over from that, even though there were usually no UFOs ever seen with crop circles, with a few exceptions. But by and large, the evidence cases, the close encounters of the second kind, really vanished completely. And it's very, very rare now, at least for the past 20 or 30 years, to have a case with any kind of trace or evidence. So that's one thing. And I just want to add about the crop circles that I know Doug and Dave have been blamed for the crop circles in England, on the Salisbury Plains and wherever else in England from the 80s. Curiously enough, and I'm going to be talking about this or writing about it in my next book, that the first crop circles were actually discovered in Canada in the 1960s, and they were associated with UFOs, and they were investigated by the Royal Canadian Air Force. In fact, we found the official documents of the Royal Canadian Air Force in their investigation files, investigating a series of rings found in fields in Alberta I'm trying to remember, I think it was June or July 1967. And there's photographs in the files and everything. There was a ministerial inquiry. The Minister of National Defense for Canada actually ordered an inquiry into these. And we have this documentation. So it's very interesting that Canada can lay its claim into crop circles.
Stealing it from us.
Yeah. What's your take on crop circles then? What do you do you think is causing?
Well, I mean, I actually caught some hoaxers myself. And Doug and Dave never made it out here. But I did catch a few people, two different sets of circles. One was a high school student who admitted that he was making them. Another one was suspected, and we eventually found somebody who owned up to it. My attitude was, well, actually, I can say that I'm to blame for the crop circles coming to North America. Because, and this is exactly what happened. That I forget what year it was, but it was just after they were very, very popular in England, and a reporter from a radio station here in Canada contacted me and wanted to know my opinion. And the question was, what do I think of crop circles, and how come, how come there aren't any in Canada? And I said, well, it sort of proves my point that they're not really aliens trying to contact us. I mean, rather than make circles in wheat and corn, you could just send me a fax or something like that. But I mean, right outside of where I live, there's actually a large, very, very large wheat field. And I said, why don't they land or do whatever and create a crop circle in the wheat field? And so the aliens were actually listening into the radio station, because the very next morning, crop formations were found in this wheat field. And that started off the crop formations in North America, and they spread like wildfire. So,
brilliant.
That's awesome. You sort of mentioned a couple of times about the mounted police and the government. I know that you have some involvement with the government, with the Canadian government, and that I believe that they send you some UFO reports and have done for quite some time. Mm-hmm. So I sort of got a 2-point question: is one, how did that come about? And two, what is the Canadian government's approach to it? Because we hear a lot about America, especially at the minute, but we don't hear much about the American, the Canadian sort of government's opinion on it. So yeah, that sort of 2 questions is: how do you get involved in part of the government? And two, what has been their approach to the subject?
Sure, it is really unusual, and I hadn't actually made a secret about it that I've been receiving Canadian government documents about UFOs for many years, and it came about because of my astronomy background. Actually, I had been in Ottawa doing some research, and the Canadian government had been investigating UFOs through an organization called the National Research Council of Canada. And they have quite a repository of UFO documents. In fact, they're available online. They've been converting a lot digitally. So they have decades and decades. I think there's something like 9,000 separate documents that are available online right now. And this National Research Council of Canada had an agreement with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to investigate UFOs, because the National Research Council had a division interested in meteorites. And the theory was that most UFOs are explainable, and some may be meteors, and some meteors actually make it to the ground and can be found as meteorites. And the meteorites themselves are very valuable to science. And so the National Research Council was looking for information on people who had seen meteors. And of course, they realized many of them are reported as UFOs. So the National Research Council enlisted the RCMP to investigate and collect information on all the meteors, or the UFOs, that were reported in Canada, and alert the National Research Council if any meteorites were found. And they actually did. This actually happened a few times where people had reported UFOs. They had enough reports they were able to triangulate and find the meteorite on the ground. However, most of the reports were called non-meteoric, and this was the classic UFO sightings from pilots and objects in the sky that clearly are not meteors. And that was a repository in Ottawa in the National Archives. So I was looking in the National Archives, but at the same time I was doing astronomical research. And I was in the astronomy department of the National Research Council speaking with the people who were involved in this, and they were bemoaning the fact that these UFO reports were coming in, and they really wanted to get out of the UFO business. They're sick and tired of this, and it's simply not in their budget. And besides, the people who were involved in the meteorites, they had retired, and the Canadian Space Agency was doing more stuff with the Americans on the Canadarm and all that sort of stuff, and the space shuttle. So I just, over a coffee, had actually said, why don't you just send the UFO reports to me? And they said, oh, well, that's an interesting idea. That was in about 1992, 93, 94. In 1995, the agreement between the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and the National Research Council terminated. And then in the year 2000, I got an interesting phone call in Winnipeg here from somebody from the Department of National Defense, casually asking, are you the person that we should be sending our UFO reports to? And I said, well, of course, yes, absolutely. And I started receiving the UFO reports. And that continued up until about last year. I've been getting reports for the National Research, some from the National Research Council, but mostly from National Defense, some from the RCMP, from pilots, Transport Canada, and there's not a lot coming in. I mean, in a typical year, there's maybe a dozen or two. But there's something like 300 or 400 cases that I now have just from coming through official channels. What's curious is that there was a really big interest. There have been some articles in Vice and other media organizations that found that this was occurring. And so the question came up, why is the Canadian government sending a civilian these materials? And I guess some heads rolled, because suddenly I stopped receiving those documents. Now, the good news is that through access to information requests in the United States, they are called Freedom of Information requests that you file and get some access. And the good news is, through access to information requests, a lot of these cases are still coming through, but they're taking a little more labor and effort. But the Canadian government has had if you look at the record, since the 40s, we have documentation on Canadian government agencies and the Air Force receiving or investigating UFO cases all along. It's a gold mine of information, unlike the United States, where after Project Blue Book folded or officially closed in 1969, we really don't know what the United States situation has been up until recently in 2017, when it came out that there had been these, this investigation project, and something may be coming in terms of official reporting from this task force, even though nobody's seen anything for 6 months now. So, so there's 50 years that we don't know exactly what was being seen and reported in the United States, but we do know in Canada there has been quite a bit. And curiously enough, there have been quite a few American reports that have made it into the Canadian files as well. So if anything, the Canadian government has been very useful in getting a better understanding of what's been seen in North America, because, of course, Canada is partnered with the United States in NORAD, the North American Air Defense, and there's lots of NORAD reports in these government files as well. So we do know that the government has been interested, and that pilots are making reports all the time. In fact, not UAP, but they're actually called UFOs in Canada in the Transport Canada database. And there are cases like that that are being reported all the time.
Do you get the impression, when you were getting these reports sent through to you by National Defence, etc., did you get the impression that these had been investigated before they got to you, or you were just getting the raw report?
Yeah, I was getting the raw reports. In fact, I think the assumption that I was the one who was going to be doing the investigating, and in fact, I did in many cases where I immediately contacted the person reporting. In many cases, they were pilots themselves and military personnel, and I ended up speaking to them about what they had seen. And in many cases, I would receive a fax or an email about something that had happened just a matter of hours before.
All
So
right.
it was very, very swift to investigate. I got the distinct impression that the government was not actively investigating UFOs; that it was a hot potato, and nobody seemed to know what to do with them. And that had been the case going back to the days of the National Research Council too, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, where the officials involved, they really had no interest in the subject, but they were simply going through the motions and filling out forms. In fact, what's interesting is that there actually was a form to fill out by Canadian pilots and also in national defense, called UFO Report, and they would fill in date, time, location, that type of thing. And we have those. So the Canadian government was not investigating, but was taking down the information and recording it.
That's pretty good, because in the UK we just hit with walls just all the time, just zero interest.
And the point that I've made a couple of times is that there are a lot of reports from pilots who are seeing UFOs or lights in the sky or things approaching their aircraft, and their onboard collision avoidance system says that there is something in front of them when there's nothing to be seen, and things like that. And I've made the point a number of times that if UFOs don't represent anything alien, and there's no evidence that they do, but in the devil's advocate position that all these reports that are filed by pilots represent a technical malfunction with their radar, or what they're seeing, the lights in the sky are unregistered aircraft, drones, alien, but in the sense of from another government, from another country. I think that argues that the UFOs that are part of these reports should be investigated in much more detail. Because if it's a technical problem, these are airliners that are flying hundreds of people on every flight, and that's possibly a danger to flight safety. And if it's a problem with the pilots themselves who can't tell the difference between a meteor in the atmosphere and something passing close to their aircraft, maybe pilots need a little more training, and that in itself should worry some people. So even if UFOs are not a national threat or an outside threat, they're enough of a concern, I would think, that there should be a more intense investigation. And I hope that this task force in the United States takes this on in that earnest.
Do you think that reports from the likes of pilots and military personnel, which like you mentioned, the United States new task force will be mainly military pilots and them that are going to be reporting this, do them type of reports hold more credence to you, or are the everyman sightings just as important?
Well, I mean, there's no question that what are reported by pilots are very similar to what the typical citizen will be reporting. So in that sense, I think there should be equally weighted. The advantage with pilots, of course, is that pilots have 10,000, 20,000, who knows how many thousands of hours observing, whereas somebody walking down the street may only be looking at the sky occasionally. So they would be more trained observers. There's some very interesting reports from Royal Canadian Mounted Police officers, for example, reporting disc-shaped objects at close range, and one would assume that the police wouldn't be making up those types of cases for fear of their reputations and positions. So we do get cases like that, and you assume that people who are trained as observers would be making good observations. Curiously enough, with the task force report from the United States that was released, the unclassified version that we've seen, they've admitted that they were only looking at pilot reports, and even that, in that sense, only during a very narrow period and only from certain military bases. Well, what about the average person who's not a pilot and who's not in the military? Are they going to be investigating those cases? Because there are certainly many of those reports that are, and many of those are very good. We have no idea about the breadth of the investigation, how they're going to gather the information, how the investigators are going to be trained, how they're going to be communicating it. And in the United States alone, I can't imagine how many military bases there are. Does that mean that there's an investigating officer in every military base in the United States and around the world, who are going to be trained in the same way? And what does that training look like? There's so many questions that come to mind just off the top of my head when we're thinking about this. I have some reservations about what this task force might be doing and what their reports might be looking like, because I mean, in Canada alone, if we're looking at 1,000 UFO reports, you multiply that by a factor of 10 for the United States. So let's say 10,000 UFO reports at the very least, and many other countries. I mean, there's a lot of reporting out there. I don't know what the databases and the analyses are going to look like. And I think we have to take a very close look and be a little more involved in what's going on.
Definitely. So I was wanting to talk about just one of your books. It's called When They Appeared, The Falcon Lake 1967, which is based on the, as the title suggests, the Falcon Lake incident, which happened in May 1967. You worked with was it the actual witness that you worked with on this case?
Yeah, we worked directly with the witness. It happened before I began investigating, of course, but what happened was, by happenstance, I was actually a boyhood friend of the witness's son. In fact, we used to hang out together and ride our bicycles and so forth. And when I began investigating UFOs in some depth in the 1970s, I realized I knew somebody who had a very close encounter, and I contacted my friend, and because there was a friendship there, they invited me into their home. They had been avoiding media and avoiding talking about it for many years before then, but because I was known to the family, they invited me in, and I kind of reopened the case. It was kind of a cold case. It's a fascinating case because I argue it's one of the best documented, with the most evidence of any case anywhere in the world. And I can say that with some authority because I've been able to gather several hundred official documents from various government agencies investigating the case back in the 1960s and onward. The witness was available to me to re-interview. There are audio tapes of the original investigation back from the 1960s and into the 70s. There's physical evidence found at the site. I had opportunity to speak with some of the original Royal Canadian Mounted Police investigators. It was also investigated by the Royal Canadian Air Force. The site itself is accessible and has been located. The witness experienced physical injuries, and we have the medical records and documentation from the doctors who treated him. He was also taken to the Mayo Clinic in the United States for a psychiatric examination, and we have the psychiatrist's report that basically says this is a person who doesn't make up stories. And you put that all together, and this is a case that has everything that ufology looks for. Furthermore, part of the evidence, the physical evidence, is radioactive material. So the story is that this was a fellow who was a big amateur geologist, a rock hound. He liked rocks. Went into the forest one day in May of 1967, very early in the morning. And he settled down at lunchtime, excuse me, and his attention was drawn to some objects in the sky, very bright objects. One came down and appeared to land on a flat rock outcropping. This is a very, very rocky area of Canada. And it was a Hollywood-style flying saucer, about 35 feet across, with a dome, lights coming out of the top. And he himself had been in the military, and he crouched down behind a rock and was observing it for about a half an hour before he got brave enough to walk up to it. He had seen a little door open in the side of this. He said it was a burnished metal that didn't seem to have any rivets or seams. He was very puzzled by this. And he realized it must be some sort of American secret craft or military or space vehicle. As a matter of fact, this was right about the time of the first Apollo tests, and the moon mission was in the news. So he thought maybe this was a moon landing thing that got off course and landed in Canada. It broke down. So he walked up and he shouted out, because he had heard some voices from coming through this little doorway. Hey, Yankee boys, come on out. I'll give you a hand fixing your broken down flying machine. And the voices stopped. So he thought, oh, maybe it's not America. Maybe they're Russians. Well, he happened to be from Eastern Europe. So he called out in Russian and a number of other languages. And there was no response, but he ended up being very close to this thing. He touched the side of it with a rubberized glove, which melted. And all of a sudden, a blast of hot gas came out of this thing as it took off, setting his clothes on fire, setting fire to the leaves on the ground, and the thing left him. He eventually sought medical help. He had to get back to civilization. He was a kilometer or so into some very rugged terrain. And he was treated at the hospital. The investigations began. Royal Canadian Mounted Police showed up at his house. The Air Force investigators showed up at his house. UFO fans showed up at his house. The media showed up at his house. And that's what the title of the book refers to, when they appeared. Not aliens, but when this barrage of everybody wanting to know the story. And the investigations. He was physically injured, burn marks on his abdomen. His chest was singed. He had first and second degree burns. And this radiation was found at the site. In fact, the radiation levels were so high that the government had considered closing off the entire area, which happened to be close to a resort, to all access. Fortunately, they didn't. It would have been hard to explain, I suppose. But they spent countless man hours investigating, and it was intensely investigated. We have the documentation, as I say, and the witness himself was willing to be interviewed extensively. So, this is a really good case.
Definitely. What was the result of the official investigations into it?
Pardon me?
What was the result of the official investigations that took place?
The official conclusions by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and the Royal Canadian Air Force separately said that they had no explanation for what had happened. Now, the Condon report, the United States Air Force had sent somebody to investigate, and it was his opinion that it was all a hoax, that the fellow had, burned himself on a barbecue and just made up the story for no reason at all, and said there were inconsistencies in the report. Well, there were no inconsistencies. His story remained the same all along, and I don't know what happened. I don't know. It's not absolute proof that aliens were involved. In fact, some people have speculated that this was some sort of secret military test vehicle. But if it was, it's a test vehicle of a kind that's never actually made it into production. So one would think if you had a vehicle capable of doing what this thing did, we would have seen it long ago. So I don't know what this was. But the witness, even though it's a single witness case, there's enough documentation and evidence that it's probably one of the better cases around.
What about you? You had any of your own UFO sightings?
I, my own explanations, I don't know. I really don't know. I know I've spoken with the witness. He's passed since then, but his family, I interviewed them. His son, who co-wrote the book with me, he has no idea. He believes his father indeed had an experience. And again, I say, I don't think it's absolute proof that aliens are involved, and I don't see the proof that it was an American secret weapon either. What it was, I have no idea, but it certainly is mysterious.
So what do you think this phenomena is? Do you think it's aliens? Do you think it's future humans, for example? What do you think the phenomena is?
Well, I've been at this for, close to 50 years now. And I've investigated thousands of cases, and I've spoken to thousands of people. My background in astronomy says that there are alien civilizations out there somewhere, mm-hmm. but given the limits of stellar evolution and the distances between the stars, it's really tough to travel between the stars. We don't have any physical evidence that proves this one way or another. However, given that our sun is a pretty average star, there's stars that are much older and much younger, but let's say there's a star out there not too far away that's a little bit older than our sun, which means that planetary evolution would have evolved a little bit faster, that life may have evolved there sooner than ours, and not just 100 years earlier, but 1,000 years, 10,000 years, 100,000 years. Mm-hmm. I mean, I have no idea how science and technology would evolve and look like even here on Earth in another 10,000 years. I mean, the technology we're using to talk right now didn't exist 50 years ago. I can't imagine how we would be doing this podcast 50 years from now in the future. So to think of what the technology might be like 1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 years, I don't know. And if somebody has a bit of a head start, they may have figured out a way not to break the laws of physics, but bend them or use them in ways that we haven't even imagined yet. So traveling between the stars might be possible, but we don't have the physical evidence and the proof that this might be so. It's great to speculate. There's some wonderful theories out there. We're living in the Steven Spielberg, or more likely the James Cameron universe. That Avatar. I mean, Avatar. The next set of movies is coming out, I think, this year, isn't it? The first one.
I think so.
Anyways, it takes place on the moon around a planet that revolves around one of the Centauri stars, which is very, very close to Earth. So the science is possible that there might be a civilization like Avatar, really. But traveling between the stars, that's a tough one. And yet it's great to speculate, and certainly it drives people. It's certainly how the space program in the 1960s for the Americans drove a lot of people to get more involved in science. And maybe ufology is driving a lot of people into science fiction, into speculating and traveling between the stars, and becoming part of NASA and JPL and the European Space Agency. So I'm hoping that this is a positive thing, that the interest in UFOs will lead more people to speculate on our place in the universe.
So have you had any UFO sightings yourself?
That's a qualified no.
Okay.
And the reason I say it's a qualified no is, I've been out on many sky watches where I was assured I would be seeing something, and I've seen a few things, and I know more or less what these things were: distant aircraft, marsh gas, things like that. But I remember as I mentioned, I've gone through the Canadian government's documents in the National Research Council, and they go back quite a number of years. And I was looking through a number of reports from 1978. And I noticed one of them was from here in Manitoba, where I am. And I looked up the name of the person who had seen it, and it said Chris Rutkowski. And I'm thinking, what? Who? What? And I realized that back in 1978, I had been coming back from a trip into the countryside to talk to witnesses about UFOs. And as I was driving, I remember seeing a light in the sky, and I realized it was heading for an airport. So I thought, oh, well, it's probably an airplane, but it looked a little strange. It was a red light. And I thought, I wonder if I should report it just to see what would happen. So I duly reported it to the National Research Council, and I forgot about it. Nobody ever contacted me to follow up. Nobody came to my house to grill me or anything, and I completely forgot about it. But there in the government records was my report, and it was quite interesting to think that yes, this actually does work sometimes.
So kind of moving on a little bit from UFOs, you've released books on Sasquatch, on lake monsters. What opened you up to sort of these other aspects of sort of the unknown? Was it like sort of, does the interest in UFOs give you more of an open mind that these other things could exist?
It actually goes the other way. I was more Fortean in the original iteration of myself. I was fascinated with the mysteries. I remember as a young child reading. Is it on my? I think it's on my bookshelf right here. By Hoovelmans. I think it was In Search of Lake Monsters. Where is it now? You've got me thinking now. But I remember taking it out of the library, reading everything I could find on lake monsters and Sasquatch. And interested in ghosts and all the wondrous things that were gee whiz that you watched in movies and television, and I thought it was it was interesting that I had heard stories about these types of phenomena here in Canada, specifically in my area in Manitoba. So I thought it would be interesting to write a little book about all the unusual Fortean phenomena here in Manitoba. And that became one of my earliest books, called Unnatural History. And I documented ghost stories, UFOs, Sasquatch, lake monsters, some indigenous stories and so forth, meteorite craters. I was fully Fortean. It was quite fascinating. But it seemed to be the UFO reports at the time. And that's exactly just before I had gotten into the university. Was fascinated with some of that. That seemed to be there were more UFO reports than Sasquatch reports, for example. Many more, and many more lake monster reports. So I thought, well, maybe I'll specialize a little bit, while I kept my hand in with some of the other phenomena, and I became more involved in the UFOs. But to this day, I still have an interest in reports of the other phenomena. I remember doing a television series or a television special about lake monsters, and speaking with master anglers who swore up and down that they had seen a creature with a long neck rising out of the water in one of the lakes here in Canada. With Sasquatch, I spoke with hunters who had said that they had seen, these hairy creatures walking across through the bush in front of them. And I investigated some paranormal phenomena. And actually, historically, Manitoba has had some very interesting cases. It was where Arthur Conan Doyle came to Manitoba to talk with a researcher named Thomas Glendinning Hamilton to investigate reports of ectoplasm manifesting during mediumship. And so, I investigated this. We did some tests with clairvoyance, and psychometry. The focus of my my interest, of course, as I mentioned, was more on the UFOs eventually, because I had to specialize. There's just far too many. But I maintain contact with investigators in all the other areas of phenomena.
So one sort of thing I want to go back to, you mentioned university again then. Something that I found interesting, listening to you talking on other podcasts, is you work with the University of Manitoba and you actually set up a crowdfunder which was pretty successful in order to get basically all your documents scanned and available on the university website. I just thought that was pretty amazing because, again, you don't really hear many academical side of things where you have universities that are sort of interested in this thing. So it's quite cool that that university in particular has this big interest, I guess, in getting information out there.
There are some interesting, notable collections, though. The University of Manitoba, not well known to the public, but it's known throughout archival academic research. I think it has now almost 50, if not more, funds and collections of paranormal phenomena, and ranging from EVP sessions to artifacts such as pendulums and bent spoons and photographs of ectoplasm and spirits and so forth, and many collections. In fact, Dan Aykroyd, one of the Ghostbusters, his father investigated spiritualism, and his collection is actually in the University of Manitoba in the archives. And what happened was they'd been doing this for some time, and working at university, I knew many of the individuals who were working in archives, and one of them approached me back in 2017, I guess, wanting to know if I would be interested in donating my records on UFOs out of historical necessity, because it's a historical record of what people had seen, and specifically wanted to know about the Falcon Lake case. And all the documentation there, and I had been seeing these cases amassing in my basement and in my study for some time. Just imagine what 22,000 UFO reports might look like physically, and I was debating, what am I going to do with this? How am I going to store this eventually? And so they asked me if I would be interested in donating them all to archives. So I said, sure, why not? That would be a great idea. So the first batch of material was all of Falcon Lake material, and the idea was to eventually digitize all of that. But they're also getting all of the other UFO sightings. In fact, I've now transferred, I think, almost maybe 90% of all my UFO files are now in the archives. And I would say books, maybe a smaller fraction, maybe a tenth of all my books, because I had something like 2,000 or 3,000 UFO books and related phenomena. So that's a little slower. But eventually they're going to get everything. And the crowdfunding was specifically for digitizing a lot of the UFO reports. And they actually approached me for that. They said, well, would you like to help us raise money for the digitizing? Because it's simply not in the university budget to digitize all that. Just imagine how much that would take. So I said, sure. So I agreed to do a little video for them. And the crowdfunding campaign was much more successful than they had anticipated. I think they had thought that they could raise maybe $20,000, and they easily surpassed that. The problem is that the pandemic has effectively shut down the archives, and so nothing has been done with it whatsoever. So it's going to take a number of years still. Curiously, last year, Stanton Friedman, the ufologist, after he passed, his estate donated all of his papers to the province of New Brunswick, which is administered by the University of New Brunswick. And they've just started making a dent in that. They've speculated that it will take 10 to 15 years to even catalog the papers that Stanton Friedman had donated. So it's going to take some time, but there are a number of other collections. University of Ottawa has a collection called the Arthur Brake Collection. He was a ufologist. John Musgrave was a Canadian ufologist, had his papers around. And Isaac Coy, who's a barrister in England, very well-known documentation expert in ufology, has made a point of assisting some archives around the world of amassing more information about UFOs. And I think there's a list now of maybe 60 or 70 or maybe even 100 separate archives related to UFOs around the world. And this ranged from the Edward Condon, the Condon Report, his papers are available, Donald Menzel's files, and there's a lot of science and researchers files that are becoming more available. So there is a push for academia, and there are scientists that are interested in this, absolutely, and it's just a matter of approaching it in a scientific manner. In fact, my book that's coming out in a matter of months is sort of a companion volume to a book which is a doctoral thesis written by a fellow named Matthew Hayes, who's a historian and archivist from I think Trent University in Canada, all about the Canadian government's interest in UFOs. So, there is a big push for science, and I hope that this task force, even though it says it's going to enlist scientists investigating and the scientific community, I hope it actually does. Certainly, Avi Loeb's Project Galileo seems to be very science heavy, but it seems to be a lot of people who've never taken an interest in UFOs before. So let's see what comes out of all this. It could be a very interesting decade.
Cool. So just one last question from me. We spoke a little bit earlier about how the sightings and types of cases being reported have changed since the pandemic. I wanted to go back a little bit further than that, and how do you feel that social media has changed people's perceptions and the types of cases that are being reported? Because obviously with social media there's all sorts out there, as me and Ash well know from the people that contact us, but I just wonder, has that had any noticeable impact on the A, quality of reporting, and B, types of cases being reported?
Yeah, there have been some changes. I mean, when we started the Canadian UFO survey, a lot were paper copies, and that evolved into faxes, actually teletypes and then faxes, and then email. And over the past number of years, certainly we've been getting more reports through social media. It's common to get reports through Twitter. There's a number of Facebook groups that are very active now that receive UFO reports. We get reports through Reddit subreddits, and I'm trying to think, did I get I think I may have got a TikTok report last year for the first time. I'll have to take another look. I mean, YouTube goes without saying, you can find lots of UFO reports on YouTube. The problem we have with that is that you kind of need some basic information. Date, time, location, description, duration, color, shape, we kind of need all this data. Mm-hmm. When somebody posts a video, whether it's Facebook, YouTube, or TikTok, you don't get that. And it's simply thrown out there. What do you think of this? And there's nothing you can do about it. We don't have enough information. So social media has been very good for allowing people to tell their stories, but their stories are largely incomplete. So it actually is less information that's readily available. Curiously, we had a discussion about this among the moderators. I'm a moderator for a Facebook group called UFO Updates, which was originally a FidoNet group way back and has evolved. But it's one of the more popular groups. And we were talking about the fact that if you, your listeners were to see a UFO tonight, to whom would they report it and how? And it's a very good question that many people wouldn't know to report to Bufora or to MUFON or to NUFORC or an alphabet soup of organizations. They would tend to simply report it on social media. And one thing we don't really have is a dedicated app on for a mobile phone that would make it very easy to report UFOs. The question is, where would those reports go, even if you had an app? Would they go to MUFON? I think MUFON did have an app at one point, but it's I was trying to look for it the other day and I couldn't find it. So we need an app that would allow people on their phones to very simply report UFOs and have enough information that it could be used as data. And maybe that's something that could be looked at. So I think social media has the potential for being very advantageous for ufology, but right now it's simply more of a a loudspeaker rather than doing something particularly useful. But certainly, podcasts like yours are among the most useful things that could be done in ufology today.
We like to think so.
Yeah.
But no, it's very true. I mean, the social media is very very live. It's very in the moment as well. So it is a good place for some people to report stuff, because a lot of time they'll do it as it happens or very recent. So, but like you say, a lot of the groups that I know I belong to and the posts that I get involved in discussions with, the perceived evidence that they're providing is very sketchy at best, with very minimal, what appears to be 1980 cameras, very pixelated pictures, and like you say, they just go, "What do you think this is?" And just it's just this open conversation.
And yet, you know, we need these reports. We need people who see things to report them. So, you know, I hate to say it's better to have something rather than nothing, but I guess if somebody reported, posted a video from YouTube that they took, at least you could theoretically get in touch with them and follow it up and investigate. So I think social media has the potential to be very useful. It's just a matter of achieving that potential.
Yeah.
Some great points. So you mentioned a few of your books throughout this interview. Just want to give us a bit more detail on your books and where we can find them, where you can find more information about you and your blog.
Sure. You can Google me, Chris Rutkowski. My name is going to be in your podcast name. Amazon has, last I looked, I think Amazon had at least 6 or 7, maybe 8 of my books. Some I co-wrote with other people, but 6 or 7 of them. Some are out of print, but I've noticed that eBay certainly has a few of them. I blog at Uforum, UFORUM .blogspot.com. But the Canadian UFO Survey has a lot of information, and it's at survey.canadianuforeport.com. I'm also on Facebook. I'm on Twitter as Ufology Research and on Instagram. There are many ways of reading some of my material, and I've been posting and blogging for quite some time now. And on my blog, I actually post many original government documents that have never been seen before. So if you're looking for what's really been going on in terms of government, not just from the Canadian government, but also from others around the world, take a look and comment. But by all means, go look at UFO updates on Facebook and see what the discussions are like there. It's moderated, so it's not a lot of. We try to keep the discussions relatively rational on there. So take a look.
Awesome. We'll put the links in the show notes as well so people can find them on there. But yeah, thanks very much, Chris, for coming on. It's been pretty fascinating.
Yeah,
Great.
Thanks very much.
Great talking with you.
Nice one. Yeah, stay safe and look forward to seeing your next report when it comes out.
Okay, great. Thanks. Stay healthy.
And you.
Pursuit of the Paranormal with Ash and Greg.